There was a woman named Sarah who believed she was broken. At 32 years old, she had convinced herself that failure was written into her DNA, that success was a language her brain simply couldn't speak. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her cramped studio apartment, wondering if some people were just born lucky, while others were destined to struggle forever. What Sarah didn't know was that she was about to discover one of the most powerful secrets hidden within the 3 pounds of tissue between her ears. A secret that would completely rewrite the story of her life. Sarah worked as a data entry clerk in a windowless office building downtown. Every morning, she would shuffle through the same routine: lukewarm coffee from a vending machine, 8 hours of mindless typing, and a commute home where she would replay every mistake she had ever made. Her colleagues barely noticed her. Her supervisor treated her like furniture, and Sarah had accepted this as her reality. But the human brain, Sarah would soon learn, is not a fixed machine. It's a living, breathing network of possibilities, constantly rewiring itself with every thought, every experience, every moment of attention. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, and it means that the person you are today is not the person you have to be tomorrow. Sarah's awakening began on a Tuesday that started like any other. She was hunched over her desk, her fingers mechanically dancing across the keyboard, when she noticed something peculiar. A woman at the desk across from her, someone who had started the same entry-level job just 6 months ago, was packing up her things. Not because she was fired, but because she had been promoted. Again. How does she do it? Sarah whispered to herself, watching as Jennifer, her former peer, shook hands with the department manager. Jennifer wasn't smarter than Sarah. She didn't have better credentials. She didn't even work longer hours. But somehow, Jennifer seemed to attract opportunities like a magnet attracts metal. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home to her usual routine of mindless television and self-pity, she walked to the local library. She pulled book after book from the shelves, searching for answers. Psychology, neuroscience, success stories, personal development. She read until her eyes burned, until the librarian gently reminded her it was closing time. What she discovered that night shook her to her core. The human brain, she learned, is constantly making predictions about the future based on past experiences. It's like a sophisticated computer program, but one that can be reprogrammed. When Sarah expected failure, her brain would subconsciously guide her behaviors toward that very outcome. When she anticipated rejection, she would unconsciously signal that expectation to others. Her thoughts were literally creating her reality. But here was the revolutionary part. It worked both ways. Sarah discovered that successful people weren't born with different brains. They had simply learned to think differently, and their neural pathways had adapted accordingly. Every positive thought, every moment of confidence, every visualization of success was actually strengthening the neural networks associated with achievement. Their brains had been trained to look for opportunities instead of obstacles, solutions instead of problems. That night, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with a notebook and made a commitment. She would become her own neuroscientist. She would deliberately rewire her brain. The process wasn't easy. For 20 years, Sarah's neural pathways had been carved deep by negativity, self-doubt, and fear. Changing them felt like trying to redirect a river with her bare hands. The first week was torture. Every morning, She would stand in front of her bathroom mirror and force herself to say positive affirmations, even though every cell in her body rebelled against the words. "I am capable of achieving great things," she would whisper, cringing at the sound of her own voice. Her inner critic was relentless. "Who are you kidding?" it would sneer. "You're the same person you've always been. This is just wishful thinking." But Sarah had learned something powerful from her research. The brain doesn't distinguish between real and imagined experiences when it comes to building neural pathways. Every time she visualized success, every time she practiced confidence, she was literally rewiring her brain at the cellular level. She began small. Instead of slouching at her desk, she sat up straight. Instead of avoiding eye contact with her supervisor, she made a point to smile and say good morning. Instead of eating lunch alone in the break room, she joined conversations with her colleagues. Each tiny change felt monumental, like pushing against a massive boulder that had been blocking her path for decades. The neuroscience behind what Sarah was doing is remarkable. When we repeatedly think the same thoughts, our neurons form stronger connections, creating what scientists call neural superhighways. These pathways become our default patterns of thinking and behaving. But when we consciously choose different thoughts and actions, we begin to carve new pathways, and the old ones gradually weaken from disuse. Sarah was essentially performing brain surgery on herself, using nothing but conscious intention and consistent practice. 3 weeks into her transformation, something extraordinary happened. Sarah was in a team meeting when her supervisor mentioned a problem the department had been struggling with for months. Without thinking, Sarah raised her hand. "I might have an idea," she heard herself saying. The room fell silent. This was the woman who hadn't spoken voluntarily in a meeting for over 2 years. But something had shifted in Sarah's neural wiring. The pathways associated with fear and self-doubt had been weakened by weeks of conscious practice, while the networks connected to confidence and contribution had been strengthened. Her idea was simple but elegant, and it solved the problem completely. Her supervisor looked at her with new eyes. "Sarah, that's brilliant. Can you put together a presentation for the senior team?" The old Sarah would have panicked, made excuses, or deflected the opportunity. But the new neural pathways Sarah had been building kicked in instead. She heard herself saying, "Absolutely, I'd be honored to." This is the miraculous nature of neuroplasticity. Change your thoughts consistently enough, and you literally change your brain. Change your brain, and you change your behavior. Change your behavior, and you change your life. Sarah's presentation to the senior team was a turning point not just in her career, but in her understanding of human potential. As she stood at the front of the conference room, looking out at faces that were actually listening to her ideas, she felt something she had never experienced before. The unshakable knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The promotion came 6 weeks later, but the real transformation was happening at a deeper level. Sarah's brain scans, if she had taken them, would have shown remarkable changes. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and decision-making, had become more active. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, had calmed down significantly. The neural networks associated with optimism and resilience had grown stronger and more efficient. Sarah was literally becoming a different person at the cellular level. As months passed, Sarah began to understand that her initial success wasn't just luck or a temporary change. It was the natural result of a brain that had been reprogrammed for success. She started taking on bigger challenges, volunteering for projects outside her comfort zone, and speaking up in situations where the old Sarah would have remained silent. Each success strengthened her new neural pathways even further, creating an upward spiral of growth and achievement. But perhaps the most profound change was in how Sarah viewed other people. She began to see everyone as having the same potential she had discovered within herself. The colleague who seemed stuck in negativity, the friend who complained about never getting opportunities, the family members who insisted that people like us don't succeed. Sarah now understood that they weren't fundamentally different from her. They simply hadn't discovered how to rewire their brains. This realization filled her with a deep sense of compassion and purpose. Sarah started small, sharing what she had learned with a few close friends. She would tell them about neuroplasticity, about the power of conscious thought, about the possibility of literally changing their brains through intention and practice. Some were skeptical. Others were intrigued, but a few began their own transformation journeys. Watching others discover their potential became Sarah's greatest joy. She saw her friend Marcus, a talented artist who had convinced himself he wasn't creative enough to make a living from his art, slowly rebuild his confidence neural pathways until he was bold enough to quit his corporate job and open his own studio. She witnessed her sister Emma, who had struggled with anxiety for years, learn to calm her overactive amygdala through mindfulness and positive visualization until panic attacks became a thing of the past. Each success story reinforced what Sarah had learned. The brain's capacity for change is virtually limitless, and transformation is available to anyone willing to do the work. Within 2 years of that first night in the library, Sarah's life was unrecognizable. She had been promoted 3 times, was leading a team of 12 people, and had become known throughout her company as someone who could solve complex problems and inspire others to exceed their own expectations. But the external changes were just reflections of the internal revolution that had taken place in her mind. Sarah's story illustrates one of the most hopeful discoveries in modern neuroscience. We are not prisoners of our past experiences, our genetics, or our circumstances. The brain we have today is not the brain we're stuck with forever. Every moment presents us with the opportunity to think a different thought, make a different choice, and literally rewire our neural networks. The process requires patience, consistency, and faith in possibilities we cannot yet see. It means being willing to feel uncomfortable as we build new mental habits. It means persisting through the inevitable moments when our old programming tries to pull us back to familiar patterns of thought and behavior. But the reward is nothing less than the ability to author our own lives. Sarah often thinks about that Tuesday evening when she first walked into the library, desperate for answers. She remembers how small and powerless she felt, how convinced she was that she was fundamentally different from successful people. Now she knows that the only real difference was in the neural pathways they had built through years of different thinking patterns. The most beautiful part of Sarah's story is that it's not unique. Every day, people around the world are discovering their capacity to rewire their brains and transform their lives. The shy person who learns to become confident, the pessimist who trains their brain to see possibilities, the person who believed they were too old, too damaged, or too far behind who discovers that neuroplasticity doesn't have an expiration date. Your brain is waiting for you to give it new instructions. It's ready to build neural superhighways to confidence instead of fear, to abundance instead of scarcity, to possibility instead of limitation. Every positive thought you think, every empowering action you take, every moment you choose growth over comfort is literally reshaping the physical structure of your mind. The neuroscience is clear. You have the power to become the architect of your own transformation. The question isn't whether change is possible. The question is, what kind of neural pathways will you choose to build today? What thoughts will you feed? What mental habits will you strengthen? What version of yourself will you wire into existence? Sarah's transformation began with a single decision to seek answers instead of accepting limitations. Yours can begin with the very next thought you choose to think. Your brain is listening, ready to adapt, ready to grow, ready to become whatever you consistently tell it to be. The power to change your life is literally in your hands, because it's always been in your mind.